I will introduce one, even though they are both pretty much known to a lot of you here already. Alessandra Di Maio has curated, has organized, has prepared this series called Black Italia for us this semester. We've thrown a few different events in at her general structure, but in essence, she's the one who created the kind of interdisciplinary inquiry that we've hosted under the title Black Italia. Alessandra is an associate professor at the University of Palermo, obviously in Italy, and this year a visiting professor at Smith College, which has meant she's earned a lot of frequent flyer miles this year, going back and forth across the ocean. She's taught in addition to those two, several academic institutions, and we hope that maybe someday we'll see her teaching this course here. Her area of specialization includes Black, diasporic, migratory, and gender studies, with a particular attention to the formation of transnational cultural identities. She's currently working on a manuscript on what she refers to as the Black Mediterranean and African Italian literature. She's been the recipient of a Fulbright Scholarship, a Mellon Postdoctoral Fellowship, and a MacArthur Research and Writing Grant. She has many publications, which I won't read you. And as the host of this evening's presentation, I turn the program to her.
And in Toscano for her warm, enthusiastic support for the series and for everything else, and for having really created this occasion of encounter with Maaza Mengiste, who, besides being an excellent writer, is also a friend. So this is a special meaning for me, for us, I believe, because we met in Italy. We met in Italy for the very first time, actually in Sicily, in Palermo, which is Italy, but also a very specific part of Italy, when she was on a Fulbright, and this was a few years back, and she was starting to research on a novel that she will read from tonight, among other things. So I'm sure that most of you have already met Maaza here. She's been doing a couple of workshops in this past few days, but let me introduce her formally for those of you who haven't had the chance to read her work yet, or to have worked with her more closely yet. Maaza is an Ethiopian American writer, if we want to define nationalities, and she writes in English. So some of you might wonder, what does she have to do with Black Italia? And you will find out in a moment or two. Maaza Mengiste's first novel was published in, 2010? And it's also translated in Italian, by the way, and it's called Beneath the Lion's Gaze. The Italian translation, for those of you who are Italian first native speakers, is called Lo Sguardo del Leone. It's a good translation, and we're very pleased, to have created bridges, because, translation is also what tonight is about. It's translation among cultures, among languages, among media, visual media, writing, different kinds of narratives. And Beneath the Lion's Gaze is about different kinds of narratives, as well as your forthcoming novel is. And I think that the tentative title, I don't know if it's a definite title, it's The Shadow King. So I guess in Italian it would be Il Re dell'Ombra. Forse. And as you can hear, she's fluent in Italian. So Beneath the Lion's Gaze, you might be interested to know that, knowing that has been nominated, has been voted actually, one of the best 10 African novels published, in the contemporary era, in the decade. And this was The Guardian. We can play with this kind of, categories and with lists, but what matters is that this novel has been read widely all over the world, although apparently it's not been translated into Amharic yet, but it will be. And it really speaks to different ages and different nationalities and different histories. And this is what I find particularly interesting in Maaza's wonderful writing, this historical insight, but at the same time, this exploration of human soul, which is really what literature is about, as we know. When we read a novel, what are we trying to do? We're trying to learn about different, stories, different people, different protagonists and parts of the world, but also about how all of these, characteristics connect and what they tell us about the world and about ourselves. And I think this is what is really particularly your characteristic, like being so historical and at the same time so human in your exploration of history and of stories. And Maaza has also written nonfiction. Some of her beautiful, stories are also very intense. I, of course, have to mention the one in Lampedusa, about Lampedusa, because for the first time we went to Lampedusa together, and she wrote a beautiful piece about it. Do you know where Lampedusa is? Have you ever heard of Lampedusa, this tiny island in southern Italy? It's actually closer to Tunisia, to the Tunisian coasts, than to the Italian coasts. It administratively belongs to Sicily, therefore Italy, and it's always, it makes headlines because of the great numbers of refugees and migrants who land there basically on a daily basis. And many of them are from Ethiopia, and I like to, talk about this very briefly, perhaps at the end, because there is a historical connection right there too, and I think it's important to point that out. Why are there still people from the Horn of Africa and from Ethiopia specifically also coming to Italy, to Europe? Is there any connection there? And you can see some of these connections explored in Maaza's nonfiction, and which you can find in The New Yorker, in The Guardian, The New York Times, some videos, audio interviews, and fictional pieces, BBC Radio 4 and Lettre International. So she's really a prolific writer who crosses genres, which I find particularly fascinating, and I'm sure you will too. I really don't want to say much more about you because we have, limited time. It's 6, so we are starting a bit fashionably late Italian way. So the only very final thing I have to mention is Girl Rising, this documentary. We've never really talked about it. Right. You invited me to watch it in New York. It was a beautiful documentary covering, are you familiar with this, Girl Rising? It's different episodes of young girls who really try to go through the world through the power of education in a way. And of course, Meryl Streep was reading her story. I said, I heard this voice before. And yes, it was Meryl Streep. You didn't mention that. Yes, I forgot. Of course she hadn't. She's very humble. And I particularly loved the fact that you worked in Ethiopia a lot on this documentary. I never really expressed this in this way to you, but you're really an activist in many ways. And I know that this might sound an obsolete word, or a word that should be perhaps, reframed in 2015. But what I'm saying here is that you really do not sit in your ivory tower. She's also, a professor. She teaches in different institutions, of course, New York University, CUNY, right now at Northwestern. But you really go places, meet people, research, and you don't research just in archives and libraries, which you do anyway, and it shows in your novels, but also meeting people. That's a way of conducting research that not every novelist does. And I think, that's the human element in your narratives that really comes through very, very poignantly. So, Maaza Mengiste, thank you for, being here with us.
Thank you. That was really, I think, one of the best introductions I've
She's
had.
my
So I
friend.
will get you some wine after this. Thank you. It helps when someone who really knows you introduces you and then leaves out all the annoying stuff. I guess I'll talk very briefly about the section of my new novel that I will be reading from tonight. My novel is set it begins in 1935 when Fascist Italy, Mussolini, decided that he would invade Ethiopia, which was the last independent African nation, and colonize it to create an Italian empire. 1935, my grandfather was a young man at that time, and I remember growing up in Ethiopia, and there were two photographs, one of him in his uniform, his military uniform, I guess getting ready to fight the Italian army. And next to that photograph was another photograph of his brother, also in a similar uniform. And I found out later that his brother had died during this war. So this moment for me felt, it was personal. And I really wanted to find out more about this time in my grandfather's life that he didn't really want to talk about, except to tell me about all the stories of these heroic officers and these heroic, really peasants and farmers who took up their guns that were completely outdated. They didn't have enough bullets, but after 5 years of this struggle with Italy, Italy was defeated. A much better equipped, more modern army using mustard gas, using tanks when Ethiopians had nothing like that. The stories I would hear from him were these stories of heroism and defiance and all the things that people would do despite the oppression, despite the war. And I really, these are stories that have built an Ethiopian identity. My husband, who is not Ethiopian, and he has an Italian name, but he's not Italian either, he says that anytime Ethiopians get together, within 5 minutes, the war with Italy comes up. It can be a birthday party for a toddler, it can be a wedding, it can be a funeral, anything. You get a group of Ethiopians together, someone will say, and we won the war. And then it just starts. The whole thing starts. Yes, Ethiopia. And that's how I grew up with this, really full of pride about being an Ethiopian, about what my grandfather and his generation did. But I think as a writer, I had to think about what other stories might be there, invisible, that I haven't heard about in this. As a writer, I became, not as a granddaughter of a fighter, but as a writer, I became really curious about the other stories that were not told at these dinner tables, the other stories that maybe were not celebrated. And when I lived in Rome and I was looking in the archives, I started getting a sense, oh, I get it. Some of these stories that no one wants to talk about include stories of collaborators. Those people, those Ethiopians who worked with Italians. And once the Italians were gone, they just blended back into society and no one ever talked about that. If they were in your family, you kept your mouth shut. If you were one of them, nobody ever talked about those stories. That, for me, was a moment of interest. Well, how do I find out their stories if no one talks about it in Ethiopia? And it's through the Italian archives that I could find some of that. I also started realizing that if I really wanted to get a better sense of what Italians were doing in Ethiopia, I wasn't going to find it probably in the documents the censored documents that were in the archives that the fascist army, the fascist propaganda machine approved. I had to go somewhere else. And I started looking. I've told my students earlier today, one of the first places I started looking was in flea markets in Rome, trying to see if I could find could I find letters that families didn't want anymore, that, postcards that nobody wants. You go to all these flea markets, there are always these old things. What could I find? And I started finding some really, really fascinating and interesting information there. Letters home from soldiers, photographs that they kept with them that didn't have to go through censorship because they were their own photos, and photo albums. So I started collecting these. To make a long story very short, I started collecting these images and trying to reconstruct the war from those personal photographs that soldiers had with them. And over several years of collecting these, I came across a really fascinating album that is still something that I have a hard time really looking at. It's an album that somebody had kept in this really ornate book, a photo book, but inside were photographs of just naked Ethiopian women and girls, really in a way that felt exploitative to me. And it really, really bothered me. But that's usually a clue for a writer, that if something bothers you that much, it's usually something that you need to write about. In the midst of these images, there was one woman fully clothed with a rifle. And I had heard rumors of these Ethiopian women who fought on the front lines with men, who were part of the military just like men were. And I wondered with that, have I found one of them? Finally, I'd heard these rumors, but here's a photograph. In the midst of these others, here's something. And I started research, and I haven't found very much about these women, but in letters or in small documents, a woman will appear in one line. So-and-so took up her gun and joined an army. So-and-so went here and led an army of 40,000 men. Just so I found one or two, but that, as a writer, not as a historian, but as a writer, it's enough for me to say I can create a character. I can create a woman who is a commander of her own army because I know it existed. Now I even have a photograph, and I can see what I can do with it in a novel. So the section that I am going to read deals with two female soldiers, one who is a commander, Aster, and her second in command, Hirut. And Aster and Hirut have, in this scene, been taken prisoner by the Italian army. And I am telling this story from the perspective of the Italians, because I've always wondered in my album, who's the photographer taking the pictures of these women? What are they thinking? What's the person imagining as they're putting these photos into this book? So it's from the POV of an Italian named Ettore.
Do you want to read from there?
Yeah, I guess I can. Yes.
While you go there, I just want to add that this is why we're talking about Black Italia with Maaza Mengiste. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the history of the Italian occupation of Ethiopia, but this is a difficult chapter of, our histories.
So hopefully everything makes sense, and you can ask me later if it doesn't. Hirut was pulled out of her cell while she was still asleep and dragged outside. Blinking wildly in the sun, she shivered and hunched so low, Ettore could see the ridges of her spine. She kicked and struggled as she was led to the mud wall of her makeshift cell, fighting so hard that it took 2 askari to hold her still. She was made to stand in front of Ettore while the top of her dress was yanked to her waist. Ettore didn't want to look at her. He didn't want to be inside this barbed wire fence, listening to the mutterings of this terrified young woman. He was just a soldier. How had he come to be in this place, in front of a girl his commander believed was part of a rumored army of Ethiopian women? He turned to the major. "How do I do this, sir?" Behind him, a group of soldiers drank their coffee and whistled as the girl's arms were held down away from her chest. The major stood next to Ettore, a hand on his pistol. "Last week, a unit next to us was nearly wiped out in an ambush. We know rebels are hiding in these hills. We know some of them are women. Take the picture, soldato." The girl was looking at the ground, her chin bent into her neck. "Tell her to lift her head," Major Fucelli said. "Aren't you an Italian?" "Ragazza, ti prego, fai così," Ettore began. "Do like this." He raised his own chin, but she wouldn't look at him. The major grabbed her hair and pulled until her head lifted up. He whispered in her ear, jabbing the mouth of the gun into her ribs. Hirut pulled out of the man's hold. She spit in his face, and if he hadn't stepped back, it would have hit its mark. Ettore raised the camera to his eye. Through the viewfinder, she was just a small figure, parts misaligned until he focused and put her back together. Hirut stared into the camera, disgusted, and Ettore froze. "That," the major shouted, "that's the one you should have taken. What's the matter?" He strode forward and grabbed Hirut by the arm. "Watch." He squeezed so hard, even Ettore winced. "See? Nothing." He let go and wiped his hands on his shirt. "Now take photographs like you know how to do." Ettore nodded and focused. Hirut leaned against the wall, stunned, holding the arm Fucelli had grabbed, staring at it with wide eyes as if unsure it was really hers. "Ascaro," the major said, pointing to a black soldier. "Tell her that if she doesn't stand straight, there are men happy to make her more obedient." The Ascaro translated the major's words, his voice tinged with a rising dread. Hirut put her hands over her face as if to think in private. Then she dropped them and turned to Ettore and raised her chin. She blinked away every expression in her eyes until they were flat and dark and cold. She stood straight and put her back against the wall. She lifted her head and brought her feet together. She put her arms to her side. She stood at attention, a soldier. He took a photograph. He advanced the film. He steadied the camera again. She didn't move, so he took another photo. Then he waited, and when she still didn't move, he snapped another, identical to the one before, and another, and another, and another, and one more. Then he stopped, a slow panic building inside him. "What's this?" the major said. "So she thinks she's the Amazon come to slay Achilles?" He laughed, then grew quiet. He walked around Hirut in a wide circle that shrank until he hovered close to her ear, glaring into her face. Hirut stared past him as if he were invisible, as if he didn't matter. They stood like that for so long that Ettore turned to shoot the soldati watching with amusement just beyond the barbed wire fence, their coffees forgotten. He took one picture, then snapped another as their smiles gave way to frowns. He took a photo of the Ascari watching with their hands over their mouths, their eyes guarded. He took a photo of the lengthening shadow falling behind the major and was about to photograph the Ascari again when he heard the major say, "Are you disobeying orders?" Fucelli's back was to Ettore as he stepped away from the young woman. "I better hear you changing that roll of film soon." Ettore photographed Hirut's legs. He took her hands. He knelt and framed her dusty feet and slender ankles. He captured the elegant slope of her neck and the well-formed head that refused to bow. He avoided her chest. He was doing as he'd been ordered. She was doing what she could. Both of them were frightened, only one of them brave. As the major kept yelling for him to shoot, he stepped so close that he knew the lens could not focus at that distance, and Ettore took photo after photo of Hirut's eyes, knowing only he would ever see the way hatred swayed so easily between shame and fear. Then he took the last shot and began to rewind the film, knowing that even now, every photograph would look exactly the same. Dozens and dozens of Hiruts, glorious in their rage. Then it was Aster's turn, where Hirut was quiet and defiant. The older woman was movement and noise. She was a body crashing through restraining hands, spinning so wildly that Ettore couldn't take a photograph. When the top of her dress was pulled down, she pulled it up. When she was pushed against the wall, she slid down to the ground. When the major came to yank her upright, she grabbed his legs to throw him down. She screamed a name that made the Ascari pause, and even Fucelli said, "Now I have proof. Now I have proof. They work for that rebel leader, Kidana." From her cell, Hirut watched Aster with a trembling mouth, her hands on her face. The more the woman refused to be stilled, the more Hirut began to move. She opened her arms and swung her hands. She spun out of an imaginary hold. She was beautiful movement reduced to its most essential parts. Ettore turned away from Aster and leaned towards Hirut. He adjusted the shutter and darkened the shadows. He made her a slender figure, trying to find her rhythm, caught in a stunted pirouette. The photographs were developed. They were made into postcards and passed out to Major Fucelli's men. They were sent to newspapers and used by journalists. They were kept as souvenirs and discussed in administrative meetings. The photographs of the women were distributed to shops in Asmara and Addis Ababa, in Rome and Calabria, in officers' clubs in Tripoli and Cairo. Hirut and Aster were called many things: angry Amazon, woman warrior, African Juliet. They were handled and ripped and framed and pasted into albums, and from everywhere came the requests. Can we put them in front of huts with their rifles? Can we stage an attack with a few of your men? Put on your cleanest uniform, Fucelli. Put on your most dirty uniform, Fucelli. Put on your helmet. Put on this medal. Put on these sunglasses. Stand in profile. Stand between them, Major Fucelli. Stand to the right and tell us, what have you learned about the native? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was really beautiful, and it's the first time I hear that. So it's a new piece. I thought it was something that I heard before. Yeah. Perhaps we should tell some of the students who Ascaris were. I don't know if you are familiar with the part of history. They were basically local soldiers serving for the serving the colonial,
native soldiers.
The European colonial powers, and they were native soldiers, but they were also controversial figures in many ways, right?
Yes, they were from Eritrea, Somalia, Libyan Ascari also went to Ethiopia to fight in this war. What was really interesting about that is a decade or so before that, Eritrean and Ethiopian Ascari had been sent to Libya to fight for Italy, to colonize them. So there was this animosity when the Libyans came now to help colonize the Ethiopians. There was still that memory.
Yeah, and there is also this fascination in Italian collective imagery of the Ascaris with this spear here, right?
Yeah.
We won't mention about Ascaretti and where it comes from, right? Are you familiar with the word Ascaretti, with this kind of ice cream lollipops covered with chocolate and vanilla inside. That comes from that word. So, language has got a lot to do with history and also with colonization and colonialism. Even, what is considered our beautiful Italian language, very poetic and like a song, but there are some pretty, like connoted words. I will just ask you this and then, let you go again, but photographs seem to be particularly important in the construction of this novel, and of course, the title that we chose, that you suggested for this, Cara, Mamma, Sono in Africa, has the word cameras in it, and soldiers and empires, because Italy was a kingdom, Ethiopia was an empire, but when Italy occupied, Ethiopia became an empire. So there are like two different imperial histories overlapping there. And of course, this comes through in your books, but, do you want to tell us more about how you construct your stories, how you fill the gaps you were mentioning?
The thing that's really important to me as a novelist is looking for stories of, I can find in archives and I can find in history books the battles, how many people were killed, the kinds of injuries people sustained, where something moved, what was a strategic location. I can find those things through just regular documents, but it's not enough as a novelist. You have to be able to step into the skin of those people who were marching day to day. And it's not really just to talk about the march or the terrain, but what did they wear? What did they eat? What were the rations like? What did they do for entertainment? And this is for the Italian side. Even the Ethiopian soldiers, when they sat around at night singing songs, what kinds of songs were they? Could the Italians understand? Could Italians from Sicily, did they interact well with Italians from the north? What were those dynamics like? And it became more apparent to me that I would have to go to the people themselves, the sources that came from these soldiers, and photographs became a way for me to try to reconstruct a bit of the daily life and their world, more so than in letters. I was finding most of the time when soldiers, at least the letters I found, when they're writing home, they were only telling what they thought their mother or their family, their wives, would be comfortable in hearing, and not necessarily the most honest realities of what war is like. But the photographs, not the ones they mailed home, but the photographs that they kept with them and carried with them back to Italy, meaning that they didn't go through censors. That was where I found some things that were really disturbing, some things that just showed these soldiers relaxing, having fun, being funny. I've laughed through some of these photos where they will take their sunglasses or put them on a donkey, and everybody stands around and poses, and this stuff is hilarious. Like you can tell that they're young and they like to have fun. But then also the crueler side of life. So you have sometimes in one album something like that where they're dressing up a monkey, or they have, they're playing around with something. Then in the next one, they are getting ready to assassinate a group of Ethiopians. And this is in the same album. And it gives you a sense of really the kind of insane life they must have had, going from one moment to another. And I also know from just my own stories and my grandfather's stories that those soldiers were never quite comfortable in Ethiopia, that there was a rebellion in almost every part of Ethiopia, except for maybe Addis Ababa, that no soldier that was there was ever truly comfortable. If you were up in the highlands, if you were in certain parts, you were watching your back all the time because there were constant ambushes, constant. until Italy left. So I tried to imagine also what that was like to always watch out for yourself. It's interesting, where U.S., we hear these stories of Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm thinking of a few years ago when everyone was talking about Fallujah and how that city just erupted with, that the U.S. could never quite get it. And then there was another city that was never quite under control. And even now, it's just the certain parts of the Middle East, it's just pure chaos. But if you think of Ethiopia, had that level of these guerrilla fighters, these acts of bombings and whatever kinds of sabotage Ethiopians could do, they did. And so I'm looking at this story both from the side of these soldiers and what they might have experienced, but also the side of the people. The Ethiopians who really didn't ask for the war. They didn't ask for for people to come in and invade the country. But all of a sudden, they were being subjected to poison gas. Women and children were killed. All this stuff. So these photographs that showed some of that gave me a sense of the story, not only from the Italian side, but I got to see what Ethiopians might have experienced, because my grandfather never owned a camera. He had his photograph taken in a studio just before he left. Most Ethiopians didn't have it, so it's really through these Italian photos that I'm able to get a sense of Ethiopia. And of course, both Ethiopian and Italian soldiers rarely talked about the women that were fighting there. So their stories have been kind of hidden by both sides. And it's just through that one photograph I found, and I've recently found another one, that I know that they existed.
It's also very interesting that your novel is really so full of details about the military battles and hierarchy and different historical personalities merging with the creative heroes. And this is a woman writing that. So was it challenging?
Well, now I know how to read a military map. Yeah. I mean, now I know. I can read that stuff.
I have to tell you.
I can kind of tell the uniforms. Yeah, you learn this stuff.
You're a general by now, Maaza.
I should be a comandante. But it's interesting to me too. If I'm going to spend this long, how many years at this point on a book, I better like it. But let me tell you this, and I don't even know if this guy is going to go into my book, because you just can't make him up. And I think he will take over my entire novel if I even try to give him a page. But these are also the types of characters that existed in this time. When the Italians as soon as Mussolini made an alliance with Germany, with Nazi Germany in 1940 or the beginning of 41, long story short, Britain and France said, okay, now we really have to kind of get on the side of Ethiopia and help them out, because if Italy takes Ethiopia, they're way too close to Egypt, then that means Hitler's going to come in. We've got to stop all of this right now. So Britain sent a small force into Ethiopia to help the guerrilla fighters that had been fighting there for the last 5 years. Okay, that's the long story. So the leader of this group that he called the Gideon Force was a man by the name of Orde Wingate. If you Google Orde Wingate when you get out of here, he looks like a movie star. He is strikingly good looking, but he was also, I think, one of the strangest, most fascinating characters I've come across in this. He would call meetings of his higher ups. Here's this general, and they would show up, and he would be completely naked, like not even socks. Right, and this is how he's going to talk about war. And the guy's brilliant. He's really brilliant. you know, he would, so I have these stories from certain diaries that I've read about people who come across him. And, you know, he had a necklace, and hanging on the necklace was a raw onion. And he just chew it and talk to people. So this is, you know, so there are things like this that I can't even put this in because I don't think people would believe me. But it keeps it interesting.
Oh, we would.
You know, so you can look him up. I think some of the stuff is on Wikipedia, and it's actually, some of it is right, even though it's on Wikipedia. Stuff like this keeps me interested because there are more things like that in this war. It's just, yeah, I mean, you realize at some point that the people, even if they are in history, even if by now they've passed away, they were real human beings. And they all had their own little eccentricities and tics and bad habits and good habits. And the trick is to find out what those were or what those are and develop characters around them. So when I read these things, I'm looking for the things that will make them human, and I find them, and then it's, you know, it's not only interesting, but it's fun.
Yeah, and the title that we chose for today really refers to that. Perhaps you want to tell us what Cara Mamma Sono in Africa is.
Oh yeah, when I'm reading soldiers' letters home, they all, you know, usually the first letters, Cara Mamma Sono in Africa, you know, I'm in Africa now. Oh, here's, you know, everything is great, even though it's not great. They're giving us good food, even though the food was terrible. You know, there's just, but you read these letters and you realize how, in many ways, the soldiers, they didn't want their family to know how hard things were. And those letters home just painted this really rosy picture. But you get the sense of homesickness in them, too.
And we have some photographs to show them, but perhaps can we just quickly say what this photograph is about before I just...
Yeah, I've known Alessandra for, I don't even know how long now. I feel like we've known each other forever.
For a few lives.
But it was just recently that, and you can jump into this, that you told me, oh my gosh, you know, I have photographs of my uncle who was in Ethiopia. And I mean, how long have we known each other before this?
A few years.
A few years.
But the interesting part is that my mother told me after, you know, I was telling her about what we were doing, after Lampedusa, I think, she said, you know, Zio Carlo, Uncle Carlo, was in Ethiopia. My mother happens to be 90 years old. She turned 90 yesterday, as a matter of fact. And this was her older brother. He was her senior, 13-year. So it means he was born in 1912, and he died when I was in high school, last year of high school. So I was 17, and he was a very close uncle. We were very close to each other. You know, I'm still close to his children. And at some point after, you know, I went to Lampedusa with Maaza, we came back with pictures, and she, you know, started to comment about, you know, how this person looked like that person, etc. Then she said, you know what, I have an album. And so she pulls out 94 photographs of Zio Carlo, her beloved brother, who died, you know, like over 20 years ago. And she tells me stories, and she tells me that Zio Carlo was in Rome. He was in the army because, you know, he was serving the country, as we say, the nation. And then he was about to come back to Palermo in Sicily, which is where my family is from. And then they told him, you know, you can't really go. We can't dismiss you because we have to invade Ethiopia. That was, you know, the language. So in October 1935, he was sent to Ethiopia on these, you know, big battleships with a bunch of like 22, 23-year-old soldiers in different battalions, and he arrived in Ethiopia in January 36. And so this is Zio Carlo Sapienza in January 1936. And this is, you know, I think an interesting pictures for many reasons. He looks puzzled, he looks bewildered. concerned, I don't know, but he's trying to strike a pose, like, right, a virile pose. Now, I have to tell you that Maaza and I have been talking about this for a while, and before coming down here, we were for a couple of hours, upstairs talking about this and showing, each other pictures. And I really, what I resaw these pictures, and what she was telling you resonates, with what is portrayed in this picture, a young man who's 23, puzzled and trying to strike a pose. And I was telling Maaza, I wanted to create a story, I'm writing about it, but to me, I'm ideologized in a way, as we say in Italian, ideologizzata. So I'm saying, okay, but he was a soldier, he was a fascist. And then, my memories of Zio Carlo are, like thoughts of a very, very gentle man. That's like the poetic side of my family. The other side of the family was pretty fascist. So how do I come to terms with this? What do I see in this? What do you see in this? So this is the second picture that we're going to show you.
So let's go back. It's really interesting because now I'd like to do an example of maybe the different ways that, the way that I would look at it and the way that you would look at this picture, which is as a novelist looking at this, and really if I found this in a market, I would buy it because I think it's great that you can tell that this guy has a personality. You can tell by his eyes, it looks like by his stance. I'm really fascinated by the belt. I would look at that because the leather on the belt is newer than the leather on the shoes. There are things like this. These are the kinds of details that I would look at to try to construct, okay, so are these clothes new? Has he been through a lot at this point? What might he have been through? Their shoes are a wreck, right? They're hit, but he's going to have to wear them for a while. But the belt for me is really interesting because it's almost, I don't even know. It looks like it's really, he's not a big man.
No.
He's small. So I'm imagining all this stuff. What would he have to carry? Can he pull his weight? Let's say amongst his other friends? Or would he be the one that might be picked on by people because, he can't do this, or someone, take this. So all these things that I would be thinking about to construct a life that may not have existed for him because you know him, but I would look at it in this in a slightly different way. And I would be fascinated, we talked about this before, by the ring on his finger. That's one, and I would, if I pretended like I didn't know Alessandra and she did not tell me about this ring, I would say he's married. And so he has somebody at home also. But you're telling me?
He was not then. No, he was not married at all, not even, engaged. And of course, I hadn't noticed the ring. I'm not a writer. I'm a boring academic. I'm like, okay, let me see, the structure. Is it centered? Is he wearing a bracelet? Is this what this is?
Yeah. Oops, sorry. Yeah, that's a bracelet.
I'm noticing now.
Yeah. Maybe you don't, maybe.
Stop it. Let's go to the next. Can I go to the next?
Yeah.
Okay, this is the one that I particularly like because to me this is totally a pose. He's striking a pose, and some of these pictures, some of these photographs have a caption, an inscription in the back, right? And this is one of those. Ai miei cari col più grande affetto, to my dear family with, profound affection, Africa Orientale, which is the name that Italians used for the empire that they were creating, Africa Orientale Italiana, in an acronym AOI, Gennaio 1936, so January 1936. And do you see that number, 14? The Roman number? That's basically the 14th year of the fascist era. So that's what it is about, So we noticed with Maaza that in the formal photographs, in the ones that he had to send home, or that he wanted to send home, there was this kind of, detail. First of all, Africa Orientale Italiana, or Africa Orientale. Secondly, the year, the fascist year, as if they numbered a new calendar. In the other pictures, the ones that, as you said, he kept for himself, as every other soldier did, nothing like this appears. And the other interesting thing here is Aksum. Aksum is a city, it's a sacred city, a holy city in Ethiopia. So to me this is interesting because it really strikes a pose. He didn't smoke. Maybe he was smoking in the period of his life, but he didn't smoke. He was a very, gentleman with no vices in a way. And this there with this cigarette, it can't really hold very well, right? It's like...
Right. But I've seen a lot of these soldiers' photographs with cigarettes. And the cigarette is at an angle for some reason. Sometimes it's in the mouth and just hanging out. And I see that again and again. So I don't know if that was part of advertising, if that was something that was kind of the model of manhood.
Yes, that's what it was. It was virility.
Okay, so
fascist virility.
Yeah, so I've seen that a lot. In Aksum, by January 1936, we are reaching towards the end of the war with Ethiopia. Ethiopia has just finished a major counteroffensive in the north, not far from Aksum. And so not far from Aksum was where also Graziani or Mussolini, Badoglio, did just this massive campaign with mustard gas and poison gas. So this photograph was taken probably not long after that. There are still other battles to come, but I know from the Ethiopian side that many of the Ethiopians are completely demoralized at this point. But the rebel movement is just about to start, and it will start around this area. So it's interesting to look at the photo, realizing they're not going to be this comfortable for much longer.
Yeah, and those were really bloody months, basically, with a lot of battles. So I had the privilege of hearing this story from my mother, who's still perfectly lucid, and she told me actually this weekend that she was 10 years old, and she went to bid farewell to her brother before he took off. And then she said, my mother is like Skyping me every other day, so she's very technological. She's always been, but she was telling me, she was translating things for me. She was saying, I could not know anything about my brother. We did not know anything. All we could do was like being glued to the radio. And so they would hear this, report, this war bulletin, day after day. And she said, in their living room, they had a bust of Napoleon's bust, which scared me in the first place. So her big sister sewed some, little flag, an Italian flag, and she said, every day we advanced, I put the flag up. We, meaning the Italians. Every day the Ethiopians advanced, I put the flag down. And so she was following this, like playing as a 10-year-old. But she said, I said, you're telling me as if you were having fun. And she said, I was terrified. My brother could die any day. I could, not see him again. On the other hand, she was telling me that he was not there on the front line. There was this battalion whose name we could not reconstruct, who was there to build the radio system, right? So he was a radiotelegrafista, how do you say that? A cable radio... Radiotelegrafista.
I think that's easy to understand, right? Yeah, I think. Let's move forward a little bit to some of the other.
Yeah, this is
the one with the tukul.
Yes. This is the tent. This is them. What Maaza was telling you.
Yeah, like this is great. You can see kind of the friendships that formed and that were forming.
They could be on campus.
Yeah.
Look at this. Have you ever seen Mediterraneo, the film Mediterraneo by Salvatores? Yeah?
And I've
similar.
Other albums I have found of other soldiers, they all do this. It's
the
just
good step.
That's what it.
Yeah, but all ironically, which is also very interesting, they're all like laughing, except that then they were allied with the Germans, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is interesting. This is...
the quality is not particularly good, but this is a donkey thing. Un gruppo
di amici con
La mascotte del battaglione, a group of friends with the mascot.
And you'll see the donkeys. Somehow donkeys are a very popular theme in albums that I found, and usually the donkeys have either the sunglasses and the helmet or just the helmet. So it seems to be this, it's funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, and you were saying the donkeys, I mean, that's something that these soldiers would have been familiar with.
Absolutely. Yeah, and most of them were from Sicily, and you know, in Sicily we have even like folk songs, folk tales with ceccarelli, donkey, we even have like our own word for that. And the little boy there, you know, riding the donkey is wearing a Balilla uniform, and Balilla was the youth, militarized youth, basically, of the fascist era, to simplify things. You know, we're making things very simple. It's way more complicated than this, but we just have, you know, another 20 minutes. And so also we want, you know, to encourage you to ask questions and to, you know, comment on these, and of course, ask Maaza questions about anything you like, really, right? You wanted to see the one with the tukul, right?
I think that was that it? So these, you know, these are some of the, these are really actually good examples of the photographs that I come across in other albums. It gives me a sense of not only what the Italians were doing as they're relaxing or going sightseeing, but it gives me a good sense of the life of what was happening with Ethiopians here. A weaver, you know, and most men were weavers. And this is a picture of a loom. And it's just, for me, it's interesting to see these things that, I mean, a barber, someone cutting hair, that I wouldn't see otherwise. It's because these Italians took their cameras.
And see, there's no date there. Obviously, these were some sort of diaries. They were like a support to their diaries. This was the only photograph. You know, some photographs appeared in different copies. There were different copies of the same photograph. And so, you know, I just copied one. But this is the only photograph that had two different inscriptions, two different prints with two different captions in the back. One of them says, in contemplazione di un tukul. A tukul is a house. This is the tukul, right? The hat, if you prefer, that you can see in the back. And the other one, mentre si ammira un tukul, like while we're admiring a tukul, Abissino, un tukul Abissino. Abyssinia was the name that you know, was used to refer to Ethiopia, which is an older name for that specific region. And this is really, you know, when I saw this picture, I really decided I want to work on this, because these are kids who are there, you know, as soldiers, who were not, you know, in the internet era, not even in the television era. I mean, even now, if you speak to an Italian student, are there any Italian students here? Couple? They would consider Ethiopia as far away. It's a different climate. It's, you know, like they think of New York as close, but not necessarily Addis Ababa as close, right? So I was trying to imagine what it must have been for this young man, for my uncle, to be there and learn about this, you know, new reality and this culture. And it struck me how he put it down, how he phrased it, in contemplation of a tukul. We are admiring a tukul. So obviously there was some sort of recognition that there was an encounter there. But, you know, it's very difficult to say this way, because it seems that I'm idealizing it. You know, and of course, you know, this was a very bloody moment in history, as Maaza was very well telling you, and how she wonderfully, you know, narrates in her novels. But still, there is a human element that is there, you know. I think obviously there is also like homesickness there. Yeah. You know, like why?
And I like the woman in the back, because it looks like she's looking at the men saying, "What the hell are they doing?"
Yes.
You know, she's a little surprised.
Yeah. And again, they're posing. They're not admiring the tukul. Actually, they're like turning their back to it. But of course, there is a representation here. Shall we go to the obelisk?
Let's just go through. We can go through them quickly, and then I'd love to hear questions.
Yeah, and if you have any questions, please.
That you have, it'd be really interesting to yeah, questions, anything, or how would you guys see these? Yeah, I mean, if you look at this, one of the ways that I would look at this is, okay, not only are we seeing inside of a home, it looks like a home, it looks like either that or a priest, because not many people knew how to read, but usually priests were trained in reading the Bible. So it looks like a book, so I would assume it's a Bible. There's some light source from there, either a fire, but close to all the cotton and paper. No, maybe it's a flashlight, who knows. You know, he's reading, but it's clearly he's aware of the photographer that's there. But whoever this photographer is has also been given access to this space. So there's a kind of intimacy here. Somebody has been allowed to come in and photograph this, or maybe it's staged, I don't know, but there's a comfort level. There's a way that that little boy is looking not over his shoulder, but listening to this man, maybe a young priest in training, that tells me that this feels like a very quiet moment that's been captured, which is very different from the noise and chaos of what you think war and occupation is.
Yeah, it's like a quiet relationship too, right? The photographer or the photographer is not there, he's in this corner, right?
Yeah.
So I know you love this picture.
I really
You
like
can
it.
write a novel on it, I can imagine that. I like this, for instance, because it says tribunal, like the court. It's an open-air court, and they're discussing, come si dice, una causa su,
like any
low case.
a case, yeah. So the elders are here. The village elders are here. This is how everything was decided. And the thing that's so interesting to me in this is that the Italian that's there with, you can see the guy in the helmet, and there's another one, I think, right in the back. And so I look at this and I think it's interesting in the sense that, okay, here's a photograph of a tribunale. But then what's also interesting to me is that these Italians are there, but they're really where they're not supposed to be. That this is really a meeting that's only for respected elders of this community. So it feels like also a secondary invasion. Then they're now in this space they shouldn't be at all.
They're invading their public space. In a way, it's the opposite of what was happening before.
Really, the interesting dynamics there.
Wow. And this guy doesn't look particularly happy, the one sitting there.
And see, the way that the people are covering, that's so typically Ethiopian. When you know that someone's going to take your picture, you don't want to be seen. This is what you do.
Is that why you do that?
Do I do it?
Yes.
Oh. Yeah.
Oh.
So
I'm
and
learning
you
things.
there's this body language there that to me seems, really interesting to look at that. So we should move
Any
on.
questions? Any comments? Yes, please.
First of all, I wanted to thank you to Maaza, because I met you yesterday. We were having a writing workshop. It wasn't my first one, but it was my best one, definitely. So thank you so much. I was really looking forward to those dialogues. I love the approach that you have of looking at the photos and inventing a story, because I think for us, for students, as a beginner writers, it is very vital, because sometimes we lack ideas. We don't know on which things we want to concentrate and which ideas we can develop. And looking at a photo, we already have something. And you showed us how many things you could actually distract from those photos and all the materials you can work on and elaborate on. So it was a greatest pleasure, and thank you so much. I had one question. If you could please describe a photo in a few words, the photo that made the most impression on you of all the photos that you have seen. Thank you.
Oh, that's a good.
Tough one.
It took a long time for me to. I don't know if I might be doing that. But this Major Fucelli guy that I've written about, I had really been struggling with him. He comes off as really pretty much like a jerk in this scene, but he's not always a jerk. But I needed to find the other dimensions of him so I could create him as a full human being. And I just couldn't do it because I didn't like him. I didn't like the things he was doing in this story. And one day when I was living in Rome, I said, I need to go, I don't even know what he looks like. My mind is just shut to him. And I went to this market, and and all I said is, I am going to find, his name is Carlo Fucelli. Carlo.
Yep.
And so
one of those incidences.
so I said, I'm going to find Carlo. Like, I have to find him, so I can write him. And I found, it's just strange looking through this pile of photographs, and one of the vendors knew me by that point. So every week he would save photographs and have something ready for me to look through. And I was looking through, and I came across this photograph of this soldier, an officer, sitting in front of a tent. Clearly it looked like in Addis Ababa, and his uniform is just a little lopsided. The buttons are on, but it's a little messy. The uniform is messy. His hat is on a little crooked. His hair isn't quite right. And his face just looks ravaged. He is tired. He looks not very nice, but he is tired and he looks defeated in some way. And I knew right then I found Carlo. Because for me now, if I look at that picture, I also see a very sad man. And there was something in his eyes that held that while the rest of his face was stern. And I said, I need to find the source of that thing I see in his eyes. And I went back home, and kind of the exercise that I had you guys doing, they were fantastic today. You guys were great. The exercise I had you doing of, okay, Carlo, you tell me, what is it that I don't know? And I started writing, and this whole story came out. But that changed, because he affects the lives of so many, Ettore and Hirut and Aster and other people, just that one picture kind of changed everything. Yeah. Thank you.
Most of the objective information is very broad and like textbook stuff that you can get kind of anywhere in the world. How difficult was it to gather, point of view archives from, one group of people, another group of people, and then being Ethiopian yourself, and like, I understand it's a novel, it's not like it's not nonfiction, but still you have to, have some kind of an objective. Yeah. So how hard was that to make it, a book that everyone can read without, bashing one group and bashing another group? It's hard sometimes. It's kind of hard. But when I first started writing the book, I was an angry Ethiopian, right? I was oh my gosh, this war and this, because I knew what had been done in Ethiopia. I knew the consequences of this war. Really interestingly, I met someone, this elderly woman, right towards the beginning of when I was writing the book. I was very angry, kind of, because I would look at these pictures, it would make me so mad. A friend of mine, her father had been an officer in the army and had lived in Ethiopia for a while. And she just opened up her home to me, and all of her father's letters to her, his telegrams, his photographs. She said, here, take a look. And as I was going through that, and because I liked her so much, it started humanizing the people. So that when she, as a little girl, travels to Ethiopia to see her father, and I know what's happening, historically in that moment, what I'm also seeing is a little girl who adores her father, and this man who's being very kind to her. And it started making me realize I'm dealing with human beings. So I had to kind of step down from the data and start dealing kind of almost like walking hand in hand with these people and letting them show me their lives, as opposed to me trying to dictate what I saw.
Yeah, but I think in certain instances, though, not only what the Italians did to Ethiopians, but also because some of my soldiers are women, Ethiopian women, I know what women had to go through in that war, not only from the side of the Italian men, but also the Ethiopian men. So I can be mad at everybody, you know. I can be mad at Aster too in here, because she's a bit of a jerk later too. So everyone gets their equal treatment. Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. I mean, can I make a comment and a question?
Yeah.
Okay, the comment is I'm very struck by how as a creative writer, an imaginative writer, you have a different way into this material from someone like me who's really a historian. You know, because when I write about this stuff, I don't invent situations.
Right.
I try to, write about the situations I have documented, and therefore I can't go into certain areas you go into.
Right.
So I really like the way that, as you know, I've looked at photographs of the same period, and I've seen some of the same problems. But I think you have a very sensitive way into these images. The extract from your novel about the different positions that the captured woman fighter assumes, looking down, looking up, but with hatred, spitting. They aren't actually in photographs that we've seen, probably because they would never have been recorded, but you've imagined a whole range of possible positions that this woman can take, and I think that's really fascinating. So the comment is I'd like that, and I can't wait to read the complete novel. The question is, have you actually seen photographs in which, because I've seen some photographs of captured women patriots, and you certainly see the defiance. They're not going to be humbled, often because they come from noble families, so they consider themselves to be powerful people. And in captivity, they're not humbled. But I haven't seen some of the other ones, so I'm just wondering how much of the kind of the invented situation is, in some ways, your fantasy of how you'd like them to have reacted, or whether you've actually seen some photographs where there are these other ranges of responses to the camera.
Yeah, that's a good question. The album that I told you that I recently got, that was this album of naked women and girls, there were some where you see that defiance. And I'm not sure I don't know if they were all soldiers. I just saw that one woman clothed. But in the midst of all these other images of undressed women and girls, if you were to just look, it was really difficult for me to look through. And at some point, the only way I could do it is to basically cover up their chests and look at their faces. And you see in some of this complete humiliation, that they know that this, whatever. Yeah, and so I have seen that, and Hirut's scene is taken from one of those images of that.
But the women who are naked and not the soldiers, is that right?
I don't know, right. That's what you're saying. Are they? So I'm not quite sure. But part of the thing that I've done with fiction is also imagine that, what if it's not all noble men and women who were fighters? Hirut was a servant, but she was Aster's servant. That's why Aster has not always been very nice to her. But when these noble men and women went to fight against Italy, they often took servants and slaves with them, and those people had no choice, really, how they were going to fight. So I imagine that Hirut was one of those people that was taken. Who knows if that, I would suspect that happened a lot, though. Yeah, but that's a good question. So yeah, I made it up. Kind of. We'll see.
You're filling gaps.
I'm filling, big gaps.
In a very imaginative way, which is, which makes sense to all of us.
Yeah. Oh, that's
questions. This is unfortunately not in the PowerPoint.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Other questions?
Curiosity.
I'm just curious. How many of you in your families have really old photographs? Yeah, a few. Quite a few. Have you looked at them? Have you tried to? Anyone come across anything interesting, memorable? I'd love to hear some. I know Asa, you have. Yeah. Anyone else? Anything that, yeah.
My grandparents lived in Mogadishu in 1973 for 1 year.
Wow.
So there's a photo of him with locals. And that was kind of a starting point for a study I then did. I wrote my PhD on Somali belonging in Italy and Australia, so I kind of, the childhood memories of Somali artefacts in their house as well, I think shaped the decision to do that research.
That's cool.
Yeah, the photographs.
Any other, yeah, something else. Asa, do you want to talk about the one that you wrote about in class?
Sure, but it wasn't actually a photo.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Because it was just making up a story and imagining something. But I do have some old photos and even letters, which my grandfather wrote to his wife when he was fighting during the World War II.
Wow.
And so I have some old photos. They're black and white, of course, and a little bit scratched. The color has wiped out because of the time. But when you hold those photos, you can get closer to those memories and to the feeling which were experienced by those people. So I think it's something very precious.
That's great. That's great. Someone else? I saw some hands.
Okay, I'm Italian, first of all, and my grandfather he served as an officer, I think also in Ethiopia. I'm not sure because he died before the end of the war, so I only have the stories that my grandmother told me. And one thing that really struck me was that the only photos I have are the ones, the sort of official photographs that soldiers could buy. I mean, even if he was a good photographer, apparently he didn't shoot a lot of photos. So it's part of an official story. And lots of landscapes of naked women, of course, and animals, which is interesting, because you have naked women and animals. And but then there are the stories that he told my grandmother. Of course, he was an officer, so he was aware of the censorship, and he couldn't write what really happened there. And but he came back and told her about how he admired all the Africans. So that's, probably Ethiopians, Somali, and all the rest. We don't know about the nationalities. And so what really struck me was the difference between the official story and his recollection when he came back. And since you said you read diaries, did you notice such a thing? I mean, a diary from someone who fought in Ethiopia, and you had the chance to compare it with the official letters and photos, and what's...
There's some interesting ones. There's one, I don't even know if it's in print anymore, but it's a series of letters, Lettere della Guerra by Pino di Luca, I think his name, right? Yeah. And so he's reprinted the letters that he's written home, but then there would be footnotes where he would say, oh, the food is great. I'm just giving an example. The food is great, Mama, this and this. And then at the bottom, he'd say, actually, it was really horrible. We didn't have this and this. I remember this time, I was hungry, I was this. So he's adding on, he's kind of correcting himself throughout these letters in really interesting ways. There's another book by this young man. This one really broke my heart. If I can remember the name, where death hides in something, where
la morte si nasconde. Dove si nasconde la morte.
Yeah, but where life hides in, dove la vita nasconde something.
Dove la vita nasconde.
So anyway, it's a diary of this young man, and it is, it is.
Dove la vita si nasconde alla morte.
Thank you. So. It's really a beautiful book. This is a young man who was keeping a journal through this, sailing over his trip to the, on his way to the ship, getting on the ship. And it's so honest. And this guy, I think, it's heartbreaking. It's beautiful. If there's anything that made me
really want to humanize, these soldiers. It was, in a way, reading this diary, and he tells it like it is. He's angry at their rations, that they're not being paid, that this is late, that they made us do this and this. I can't believe I missed home. The mail didn't come. That was the worst, when mail doesn't come, and all of it is in there. He kept this diary. He made it through the war, and at the very end, he got sick. I think with malaria, not malaria, but he got sick from some injury that he had, and he was one of those who's counted as a fatality, a casualty of war. He made it, but he had a wound, and he died from that wound later. But this is a really lovely journal, and it's a really good one to get if anyone's interested. Tons of photographs in it. Some of his handwriting is in there. And I think if he had lived, he would have been a writer. Like, it really is, he has that vision and insight in there.
His name is Elvio Cardarelli. I'm reading this.
Yeah. So that one, those are good examples of that.
In the section of the book that you read, I had the impression that you were kind of taking a picture through words of a man taking a picture. So of course you are the medium of another medium. And you definitely took the position of the man who was taking the picture, but how much there is of your perception of him taking a picture, or a reaction to that kind of picture in this character?
How much of my reaction is in this character?
Yeah, like how much of your perception of the photo there is in his character, because it's really humane, the way you describe, the way he is taking the picture, like he's thinking about. There is that he's thinking about what am I doing right now, but I felt like a very strong humanity in that, and that's maybe how much is you, that humanity. Which is not, it's a good filter, I think.
Yeah, I think Ettore is, I had to figure out a way that I could be comfortable writing from the perspective of an Italian photographer taking these pictures. Ettore, he's this young Italian guy that just happens to take his camera with him. He's a photographer from Venice. And he just happens to take this with him, and he has no idea that Fucelli will use him like this again and again and again. But Ettore is also Jewish, and he's well aware at this point of his position in the army and how the census has just come out. And this is after the war. This is when the rebel movement is really big in Ethiopia. There's a census that's come out, and Fucelli, this is why I say Fucelli also he's not always a bad guy, because he doesn't care who's Jewish and who's not. He just wants good soldiers. So he's protecting Ettore. But Ettore knows that there are certain things he has to do. So this scene, when it's within the context of the whole book, becomes even more complicated. But it's the only way that I think I could work with Ettore if he had some humanity, some sense of his place also in this. So maybe it's my eye, but I think what makes Ettore so complicated later is he becomes very good at what he does, and that then it's him more so than me.
Is there another question? No? Any other questions? Well, maybe we can continue informally to ask Maaza questions, and I want to thank Maaza Mengiste very much.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you.
This was great, and and this is Black Italia too. It's important to hear all versions and all sides of history to create, like contemporary history. So thank you, Maaza.
Thank you.
I'll leave
Thank
you
you,
with the
guys.
obelisk in the back.
Yeah.